If I didn't know any better, I would say that we are all being played in America with the Bryan Kohberger guilty plea. Holy shit. The reveal of the Idaho State Police documents and the books in Bryan Kohberger's possession when he was arrested blow my mind. And no wonder people think this is a gigantic PSYOP. Let's explore this a little bit because I want people to answer. How the fuck does any of this make any sense? Now, if you've been paying attention, Moscow Police Department released a whole bunch of police documents in relation to the after the sentencing of Bryan Kohberger for the murders of the college students in Moscow, Idaho. And then the Idaho State Police dropped another 600 pages. And then they dropped more police photos. And while none of the photos seem to show any of the actual crimes, the books that they showed in Bryan Kohberger's possession in his apartment upon his arrest, again, before the plea deal, before any of that stuff, this was just him under suspicion. The books that were in his possession absolutely blow the fucking mind. I cannot make sense of this other than for the first time in my life, I'm starting to question all those people who say this is just a giant PSYOP. I'm not willing to go there. Like even me, a conspiracy theorist by nature in some regards, is not willing to go to a giant PSYOP. And yet, look at the books. And we're going to break down just a handful of these books that I have to ask, how in the hell does this make any sense? Make this shit make sense to me, please. Now, let me bring this up on screen. All right, so these are some of the books in Bryan Kohberger's possession that they pulled off of his shelves and put out to take a picture of. This, again, let's pay attention to this. This was 2.5 years before Bryan Kohberger pled guilty. This was within weeks, or about a month, I should say, a month of the murders when we didn't know who it was. And then later on, they identified Bryan Kohberger, and then they made this arrest, and then they went and searched his apartment. This is a month after the murders. And Bryan Kohberger didn't have a chance to go buy these books after he was arrested. Keep in mind, he left Pullman, Washington with these books in his possession and was arrested in Pennsylvania when the feds finally caught up with them. These were the books in his possession, in his apartment, when he was arrested in Pennsylvania. Let's take a look at this and break this shit down because none of this makes any sense whatsoever to me. The first book in the top of the screen, and let me see if I can bring this up bigger. Let's start right at the very beginning. Convicting the Innocent. All right, Convicting the Innocent, where criminal prosecutors go wrong. This is book 1 we're going to review. And again, make this shit make sense. The key idea. Now I'm going to bring this up. I think I'm going to bring this up on screen so you can read with me. Let's go here. This is ChatGPT summarizing the book because I didn't want to go read. I didn't want to go read all this myself. So what were we looking at? All right, let's take a look at ChatGPT's summary of Convicting the Innocent, where criminal prosecutors go wrong. Wrongful convictions are not rare accidents. They are the result of reoccurring systemic failures and how criminal cases are investigated and prosecuted. I've been saying this from day one on this case, that there's things wrong with this whole prosecution. We have long argued about how bad this case was. And many of you in America still have this attitude of nobody pleads guilty to something that they didn't do, so we know he has to be guilty. For frick's sake, pay attention to the books on this thing and make this shit make sense. Convicting the Innocent, where criminal prosecutors go wrong. Wrongful convictions are not rare accidents. Garrett bases the book on the 250 DNA exonerations in the U.S., analyzing court records, police files, and trial transcripts to uncover patterns. 250 DNA exonerations. What has this entire case been told about to you from day one? Oh, Bryan Kohberger's DNA is at the crime scene, remember? It was on that knife sheath. Single source DNA. They've got him plain as day. And yet you've heard over and over again for 2.5 years that we have been arguing about whether or not the feds violated laws by trying to establish a DNA profile. The defense, Ann Taylor, said over and over again, how did the DNA evidence on Bryan Kohberger double in size when the FBI got a hold of it? And yet you won't show us your work. You won't show us how you developed the DNA profile. So again, Othram Labs couldn't come up with a hit to Bryan Kohberger on the single source DNA. The FBI took over and they doubled the DNA profile in size and then said, oh, by the way, the guy you're looking for is Bryan Kohberger. We got him. But then when it came down to, hey, let's discuss this in court. No, sir. we don't want to discuss how we got the DNA evidence in court, because 250 DNA exonerations in the US, that's the focus of these books. DNA is a sketchy motherfucking sliding slope. And so here we go. Bryan Kohberger is studying a book about how DNA exonerations basically get people off of things that are like, guilty pleas for something that they didn't do. That was one of the other books in this series. So pay attention. Wrongful convictions are systemic. Wrongful convictions are systemic, not isolated. So again, all of you out there who are saying Bryan Kohberger is guilty, he pled guilty, end of fucking story. Why are we even talking about that? He pled guilty. Bryan Kohberger's books in his apartment are stacked with books on why the innocent plead guilty to things they didn't do. That should make you go, huh? And again, on the whole conspiracy angle of what the hell's going on, is this a giant PSYOP? It is almost as if, and keep in mind, I'm going to go out on a stretch here, Bryan Kohberger and his papers had information about NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, the NIJ funding that was funding $1 million for WSU to do some kind of political criminal justice experiment. The details of such are a little sketchy. The point being is that Pullman got a bunch of money to study something, and now comes this person who maintained for 2.5 years that they were innocent, and then buckled at the last minute and took a plea deal. And then in his possession are books about why the innocent buckle and take plea deals, because over 90 to 95% of convictions in America never go to trial. They never go to trial, because the process in America now is to overcharge people, trump up how much information you have, and get them to plea so that you never have to go to trial. And that's exactly what the fuck happened in this case right here. Bryan Kohberger, everyone thought that was on the side of, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, believed that in trial, at court, some major things were going to come out. We were going to see how bad, how flimsy that court case was. Oh, no, sir. They just put the screws to Bryan Kohberger, and he pled guilty so that we'd never have a trial. And that happens 90 to 95% of the time in America. People plead guilty to things rather than go to trial. And so we, America, never get to see the trial. So wrongful convictions are systemic, according to this book, not isolated. DNA exonerations reveal deep flaws in our justice system. In other words, sometimes it seems that people get let out over something that they pled guilty to because the DNA doesn't support it. Why is that happening? Mistakes repeat across cases, suggesting institutional problems rather than one-off errors. Key sources of error, another point of this book: eyewitness misidentification, often influenced by flawed police lineup procedures or suggestive questioning. I wonder if that happened in the Bryan Kohberger case. Did we not hear that Molly McMichaels, the DoorDash driver, was going to get on the stand and actually say, I saw Bryan Kohberger there? And yet when we finally got us, after he pled guilty, after the fucker pled guilty, after he pleads guilty, we get to see that Molly McMichaels never saw Bryan Kohberger at the house. Never did. There's no police report that says Molly McMichaels saw him at the house. And yet, prior to his guilty plea, we were all told in America, oh yeah, Molly McMichaels is going to go on the stand and prove that she saw Bryan Kohberger at the house. No, she did not, assholes. No, she did not. Molly McMichaels not only did Bill Thompson stand up there and say, we can't place Bryan Kohberger at the scene. How are they going to do that if Molly McMichaels saw Bryan Kohberger there? They knew she didn't see Bryan Kohberger there. The prosecution knows damn well that she never saw Bryan Kohberger there. The police know she didn't see Bryan Kohberger there. And why the fuck is it that we don't get to know that Molly McMichaels didn't see Bryan Kohberger there until after he pled guilty? Why? That should be a major problem. I'm sorry I'm on a rant, but this pisses me off. Why did we get told in America Molly McMichaels saw Bryan Kohberger at the scene and that was going to happen? And then Bill Thompson comes up in front of the judge on sentencing and says, by the way, we can't prove Bryan Kohberger was at the house. We can't place him at the house. All we can do is say his phone was somewhere near the house. That's what he said. Molly McMichaels was never going to place Bryan Kohberger at the house. That's bullshit. And anybody who thinks out there still to this day that Molly McMichaels put Bryan Kohberger at the house, you're full of shit. She never saw him there. The police documents prove it. But the police documents, by the way, didn't come out until after Bryan Kohberger pled guilty. That should bother you in America. It should. It's not going to a lot of you because you already feel that Bryan Kohberger is guilty. Nobody pleads guilty to something they didn't do. Au contraire, let's continue to watch his book shelf. All right, so here we go. False confessions emerge when coercive interrogations, long questioning, or vulnerable suspects. Bryan Kohberger could be argued to be a vulnerable suspect. It has been stated over and over again by the defense that Bryan Kohberger has autism spectrum disorder, and so therefore he's a vulnerable person. He doesn't speak right. They even said, Ann Taylor even said, we're having problems with Bryan Kohberger helping us defend himself because he doesn't have he doesn't have the same language skills. He's got autism spectrum disorder. There's something that he presents wrong. And so here we have a vulnerable suspect who can't articulate himself in a way that doesn't look a little weird because he's a little on the spectrum. So there's that right out of the book. Right out of the book. What the hell does this even mean? Invalid or misapplied forensics evidence, faulty science, overstated expert testimony. Oh, I saw Bryan Kohberger there. No, you fucking didn't. No, you didn't. Overstated expert testimony. Of course, she's not an expert. There was overstated expert testimony with the DNA evidence in Othram Labs, but that's a whole other thing. And unreliable methods play major roles. Unreliable methods, like the way that they got to Bryan Kohberger, is an unreliable method. This is straight out of the book. It's the weirdest fucking thing I've ever seen. Informant testimony. Jailhouse snitches are incentivized witnesses, frequently provide false statements, like a Molly McMichael. Again, Molly McMichael had a history with run-ins with law enforcement. She had previously had a husband shot and killed, and Bill Thompson, the prosecutor of Bryan Kohberger, was her representative. When pulled over by police in Moscow, Idaho, she said, "Oh yeah, I'm friends with Bill Thompson." That shit came out right before trial. Listen to this. Yes, I'm friends with Bill Thompson. So here we go, right out of the book. Jailhouse snitches or incentivized witnesses frequently provide false statements. That's what Molly McMichaels was going to do. Provide a false statement. I saw Bryan Kohberger there. The fuck you did. You did not see him there. It's in the police documents. We've all seen it. You did not see Bryan Kohberger there. In fact, you saw somebody with maybe red hair, maybe spiky hair. You did not see Bryan Kohberger there. And everyone now knows it after Bryan Kohberger has pled guilty. What the fuck is wrong with this country? And Bill Thompson wants people to believe Molly McMichael was somehow going to put Bryan Kohberger at the house, and yet stood up in front of everybody and said, by the way, we can't place Bryan Kohberger at the house, because it was never true. And I believe, and I've said it over and over again, Molly McMichaels was leaned on. She was leaned on to place Bryan Kohberger at the house because they had a flimsy case. Going into trial, they had a flimsy enough case that they were looking for somebody that they had a run-in and a history with in law enforcement, have pulling her over and said, "Hey, look, we can make some of your problems go away if you just say you saw Bryan Kohberger at the house." Okay, yeah, I'm going to testify in that case, and I'm going to say I saw Bryan Kohberger there. And everyone in America bought it. And even better yet, you bought it, and then they didn't have a trial, so nobody has to prove that she was full of shit. Molly McMichaels never saw Bryan Kohberger at the house. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to say that. She never saw him at the house. It's not true. Prosecutorial misconduct, suppressing exculpatory evidence. Oh, let's see. You mean like Ann Taylor saying that Bethany Funk has exculpatory evidence, and yet she's hiding in Nevada and won't come back to Moscow and is fighting it, and the feds are helping protect her so that she wouldn't come back. And the judge even says in the case, look, you do have the right to bring back people and subpoena them and put them on the stand. But it was too late. They had convinced Bryan Kohberger that even though Ann Taylor had said Bethany Funk, a survivor in the house, has exculpatory evidence, Bethany Funk knows damn well that there's something that would make Bryan Kohberger's guilt be questioned, and she didn't want to come testify. Why? What is she afraid of? Who is she afraid of? Whatever the case may be, she didn't want to come back and testify. She was afraid of what was going to happen if she came back and testified, and so she was fighting it. And even the judge had to remind Bryan Kohberger when he was pleading guilty, you do realize you have the right to subpoena her. Fuck you. You didn't have the right to subpoena. You know that wasn't going to happen. They were fighting it every step of the way, and that's why you pled guilty, because they weren't going to allow Bethany Funk to come give her exculpatory information. They leaned on people with a criminal history to be able to place him at the house when he wasn't there, and everyone bought it because in our country, 90 to 95% of convictions happen before you go to trial. You lean on people, you tell them, you trump everything up, and you tell them, look, you've got no chance. You've got a shoddy fucking trial. You're never going to get a fair trial. We will put you away, and we will execute you unless you plead. If you plead, you have a chance. And that's why 90 to 95% of all cases in America go to plea deal rather than go to trial, because of this kind of bullshit, straight out of the book. Failures of defense oversight. Many exonerees have overworked or underfunded political defenders. Ann Taylor was a public defender. That's how she started. Now, there's an argument to be made that Ann Taylor switched to being private practice sometime during the trial of Bryan Kohberger. But one of the reasons why oh my God, One of the reasons Ann Taylor stopped being a public defender is she said she had a problem with indigent defenders. That is people who are poor. Bryan Kohberger didn't have money. He didn't have a lot of money. He was a poor student. If you look at the images they showed of his apartment, he has bare bones shit in his apartment. He's a poor college student who's barely surviving. And people who can't afford a good defense, it's unfair to them. The whole system's unfair to them. Ann Taylor supposedly quit in the middle of the trial being a public defender, even though she started as a public defender with Bryan Kohberger, because she was tired of indigent people being basically run over because they can't afford a good attorney. And that's what happened in this case. Ann Taylor was a public defender, the cheapest thing, the free support that they give Bryan Kohberger. That's what this book is about how people have to accept plea deals because they have a shitty defender. Now, again, I'm not saying Ann Taylor is shitty. Let me get this clear. The more money you have, the higher paid attorney you get. The more a higher paid attorney, you've got the best speakers in America, the best brains in America. I'm not trying to insult Ann Taylor, but she was a public defender, and she decided to quit the system because it is stacked against the indigent and the poor because they can only afford a public defender. Straight out of the book. Human cost of wrongful convictions. Innocent people lose decades of their lives, families are shattered, and actual perpetrators often remain free. Actual perpetrators often remain free, committing more crimes. I have said this over and over again in this case. Bryan Kohberger, if he did it, didn't do it alone. People lured Kaylee back to the house, in my opinion. They're going to walk. People were involved in that murder. I think there was more than one killer in the house on 2 different floors at the same time. That has been expert testimony that we never got to see. It was going to come out on trial, but there is not going to be a trial. That was in the trial. The defense had an expert, 20-something books they had written. Yeah, 20-something books they had written on forensics, and they taught classes to people in college level with their books on forensics. And that person said this crime was done by multiple people at the same time. The attacks happening on 2 floors at the same time, and that was their expert opinion. And it was more than one weapon. But no, we won't fucking have a trial in this country, and so that person will never get to testify, even though they're an expert in forensics, will never get it. Actual perpetrators will remain free and will be able to continue committing crimes. I've told you that's the one thing that I can't sleep with at night, is the idea that it's not just that Bryan Kohberger is going to jail for the rest of his life and is probably going to get killed in prison, by the way, because they're already lining up getting him killed. They're already telling the narrative to the public. Hey, by the way, someone's going to kill this guy, so don't be surprised, wink, wink, nod, nod, when he ends up getting killed in prison, because we told you it was coming. People are shouting at him. People are making accusations. He's snitching on fellow inmates. They're going to kill him, and it's not going to be our fault. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Shit just happens. We won't have a trial. You won't see any of the evidence. You won't get to find out that there's other perpetrators, other people who are walking free. And I told you that I'm going to have a problem sleeping at night knowing that other people helped with that murder, and they get to walk free and maybe even get celebrated as some kind of fucking hero over the situation when they helped commit the murder. But everybody wants the easy answer. And remember, of course, nobody pleads guilty in this country unless they actually did it. So we know he did it. He pled guilty. Pathways to reform. Garrett argues that reforms can prevent wrongful convictions. We could have better lineup procedures. We could record the interrogations. We can have higher standards of forensic science. Boy, wouldn't that have been nice if we could see the forensics? Wouldn't it have been nice if we could actually cross-examine the FBI's forensic data that led to Bryan Kohberger on trial? That was never going to fucking happen. They didn't even want to bring it into trial. If it had gone to trial, they were already trying to set up, hey, look, we're not going to rely on the DNA evidence. We're going to rely on all the speculative circumstantial evidence. We don't want to have to put in front of a jury how the fuck we got to Bryan Kohberger because we know it's bullshit. And they didn't want to do that. So you know what you do? You take your odds, 90 to 95% of all cases plea before going to trial, because you don't want to have to show your work. Because if you show your work, you were going to be in trouble. There should be independent oversight of prosecutorial conduct. No shit. In short, convicting the innocent shows that wrongful convictions are predictable outcomes of a systemic problem, particularly in prosecutorial and investigative practices, and that reform is necessary to protect both the innocent and the integrity of justice. I've said this over and over again. This entire book on Bryan Kohberger's shelf is about wrongful convictions and how the prosecution is stacked to get basically people convicted with plea deals off of shady, false testimony, mishandling of the forensic evidence, threatening them with the worst possible outcome, and then accepting their plea deal. Now let's look at the next book on his list. Charged. Here we go. Summarizing Charged by Emily Basilon, right? So prosecutors prosecutors, not judges or police, hold the most power in shaping the U.S. criminal justice system, and their choices drive mass incarceration. I've said this over and over again as one of my taglines. In the United States, we have 4% of the world's population and yet incarcerate 20% of the world's prison population, despite having the belief in the innocence until proven guilty. How is it that a country that believes in innocence until proven guilty incarcerates more of the world's population than anybody else? Make that make sense. None of that makes sense. It is almost like somebody's doing a gigantic science experiment with government-funded, justice-funded funding about how people get wrongfully convicted and how the prosecution system is overstacked against an individual. It's almost like this was a playbook. It make sense to me. I know I'm sounding like I'm a madman rambling, but let's go on. This is the book, Charged, by Emily Basilon. Prosecutors as power brokers. Prosecutors decide whether to bring charges, what charges to file, and what plea bargains to offer. Screw you with all of you who are, well, it was the defense that asked for the plea deal, not the prosecution. You cannot have a plea agreement without the prosecutor essentially offering it as an option on the table. If that was an option on the table to take the plea deal, it means the prosecution offered it. So you can play semantics all your day long. Oh, well, it was Bryan Kohberger that asked for the plea deal. Maybe so. But in the end, if the prosecution offered it, then they offered it. So they could have said, no fucking way. We're going to trial. You know why they're not going to trial? Because again, 90 to 95% of all things avoid trial. You don't want to go to trial because if you have to show people your flimsy ass evidence and how you corroborated or how you leaned on people to give testimony that wasn't true, or that you had to manipulate evidence to get somebody, it's all going to hell in a handbasket. So what you do is you tell the person there's no chance in hell you're getting a fair trial. You stick them in front of a judge that's going to say there's no way in hell you're getting a fair trial. And then you say, you know what, if you plea, you can at least save yourself the death penalty or whatever the case may be. How prosecution fuels mass incarceration. Overcharging or the filing of harsher charges than necessary pressure defendants to accept plea deals. Now, not as much perhaps in Bryan Kohberger's case, but in the Luigi Mangione case that I also follow, Luigi Mangione was overcharged in 3 different jurisdictions, 2 of which are essentially the same exact crime charged by the federal government and the state in New York, overcharging people so that you can get them to be buckle under the weight of all the charges against them and say, look, we're going to get you on something. We've thrown the fucking book at you. That's what we do in America. We throw the fucking book at you. And you can beat 1 or 2 of these. Good luck. You can beat 1 or 2 of these, but we will get you on something. So why don't you play ball and accept a plea deal? Because it's better for you. Because we overcharge people in this country and you then have to cave because there's no way you can fight all of the charges. You're going to lose somewhere. So that's the way we do things in America. Overcharge people and then say, hey, look, you can take the risk. We got 50 different charges on you. You might be able to get maybe 20 of those dropped, but 30 of them are going to stick and you're going to jail for a very long time. Plea, and maybe you can save yourself some problems. These practices disproportionately impact the poor and minority communities. Again, why Ann Taylor decided that she wanted to leave being a public defender, because indigent people who are poor, can't afford a good trial in this country. It's like this entire fucking case is a design to show the problems of the American justice system. Personal stories of defendants. Basilon illustrates her argument through real case studies showing how prosecutorial choices, sometimes even more than the crime itself, shape people's future. The prosecution's choices shape public opinion more than anything else. These narratives highlight the human cost of unchecked discretion. That the prosecution had a narrative. Everyone had a narrative. Mainstream media had a narrative on Bryan Kohberger, and that's what convicted him. He was convicted, Bryan Kohberger, in the court of public opinion before he ever has stepped foot in court for his first day of trial. And in fact, they did what 90 to 95% of the time people do in this country, which is take a plea rather than go to trial, because they threaten you with everything and make it look like there's no way you can get a fair trial. So taking a plea is your best option. Accountability and systemic change. Unlike judges, prosecutors are elected in most jurisdictions, making them directly answerable to voters. Basilon argues that transforming the prosecution is one of the most effective levers of criminal justice reform. So if we have enough people saying, hey, look, we won't elect a prosecutor who does shady shit, that's maybe a step in the right direction. Of course, I don't think that's going to happen, but that's ultimately what they're asking for in this book, is like, let's focus on the elected prosecutor and stop these heavy prosecution tactics. Charge argues that unchecked power of prosecutors Bill Thompson's unchecked power is a major driver of America's mass incarceration crisis. Yes, we have a mass incarceration crisis. We incarcerate more per capita than other countries. Why is that the case in a place that believes in the presumption of innocence? Why? Because, by the way, incarcerating prisoners is really good business. There's a fuck ton of money to be made taking cheap labor under minimum wage and having them do things for you in cheap labor in a prison system that is monstrous. And everybody gets their paycheck and everybody gets government handouts to have bigger and bigger prison systems and bigger law enforcement and bigger policing thing. It is a self-feeding $billion industry of money just funneling in to fight crime. And so we've got an out of control system that is feeding itself with more and more money. It's big business. Just like we found out not too long ago, Bryan Kohberger had in his possession a video about 2 judges that were busted sending juveniles to detention centers and over trumped up charges that weren't true because they were getting kickbacks. Hey, if you send more kids to jail, we'll give you a little kickback, judge. Okay, then I'll just go ahead and say I'm being tough on crime and I'll send children to jail and I'll get kickbacks. Those judges ended up going to jail. That's how bad and corrupt our legal system is. It is a horrendous legal system in this country in many, many ways. Here's a book on Bryan Kohberger's shelf, Why the Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free and Other Paradoxes of Our Broken Legal System by Jed Rakoff. Are you fucking kidding me? This is in Bryan Kohberger's possession. Are you kidding me right now? All right, let's take a peek. All right, here we go. Why the Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free by Jed Rakoff. Summarize the book for me, ChatGPT. Well, the key idea of why innocent people plead guilty. Wait a minute. America. I forgot. No one pleads guilty to something they didn't do. So Bryan Kohberger must be guilty. He pled guilty. No one in their right mind would plead guilty to something they didn't do. Oh, unfortunately, this moron wrote a book called Why the Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free and Other Paradoxes of Our Broken Legal System. Apparently, this guy's got his head up his ass because that doesn't happen in America. People don't plead guilty to things that they didn't do. So let's just ignore maybe this summary, but let me get it out anyways. So Rakoff by the way, federal judge Jed Rakoff. Fuck's sake, people don't plead guilty to things they didn't do. A federal judge writes the book, Why Innocent Plead Guilty and the Guilty Go Free. Federal Judge Jed Rakoff is that the U.S. criminal justice system is deeply distorted by plea bargaining, a prosecutorial power, and systemic inequality, producing outcomes that are often unjust for both innocent and guilty defendants. By the way, even if Bryan Kohberger is guilty, the system was unjust to him. That's what this book's basically saying. A judge is saying, this system of plea bargaining, overcharging people, getting them to plea is unfair and by the way, systemic inequality for indigent people. I swear to God, this is like a gigantic PSYOP. Like they literally wrote, it's like they got funded by the NIJ for a ton of money to study shit just like what happened. I don't want to go there because it just makes me sound insane, but make it make sense. So this federal judge says that that plea bargaining and prosecutorial power like Bill Thompson has and systemic inequality where the poor have to get a public defender produces outcomes that are unjust for the innocent and guilty defendants. Because even if Bryan Kohberger is guilty, that trial was never fair to Bryan Kohberger. I'm losing my voice. That trial was never fair to Bryan Kohberger. Even if he was guilty, it wasn't fair. That's essentially what that book's saying. Let's go through points. The tyranny of plea bargaining. Over 95% of criminal cases never go to trial. Instead, they are resolved through plea deals. Now, I told you 90% because several places I saw that the number is 90%. This particular author points out that 95%. This is a federal judge, by the way. Isn't that what they just said? By federal judge Jed Rakoff. Jed Rakoff says 95% of criminal cases never go to trial. They're resolved through plea deals. Why? Because if a jury gets to see the evidence, they probably won't convict as high as 95%. So if you can put pressure on people to actually plead guilty to something they maybe didn't do, or maybe they are guilty, but they were never going to get a fair trial, aka Bryan Kohberger, either those people believe that he's innocent or he was guilty, but he didn't get a fair trial. That shit is exactly what this book is about. How weird that that's on Bryan Kohberger's bookshelf. Defendants, especially the poor, Bryan Kohberger was poor, face enormous pressure to accept plea deals because the alternative trial risks much harsher sentences. What did I fucking tell you? I don't understand why somebody would plead guilty to something they wouldn't do. Well, they were going to execute him. They told him they were going to execute him. They told him there was no chance in hell that they weren't going to execute him. They were telling him how they were preparing the gallows right now. They're getting firing a squad involved. They got the injection. They got the lethal injection. They got a backup option for the lethal injection. We're ready to kill you, Bryan Kohberger, and we're going to do it. Oh, you want to take a plea deal? That sounds great to us. 95% of people will plea under that kind of pressure. So did Bryan Kohberger, an indigent person who didn't have a lot of money, had a public defender, and accepted the threat of, I got to save my life because they're going to get me. 95% of the, no problem, Bryan Kohberger, 95% of the people in this country plead guilty anyways, or take a lesser plea because they have to in order to save their lives. I get it. That 95% of America is in the same fucking boat you were. Prosecutors hold overwhelming power. Mandatory minimums, sentencing guidelines, and charge stacking give prosecutors leverage. Charge stacking, just more and more charges. Throw the fucking book at them and then tell them that, you know what, something's going to stick. You're going under. Something's going to stick. Judges, listen to this. For those who want to defend Hitler, judges have little control once a plea is entered, effectively sidelining their role as a check on the state power. I swear to you, as much as I don't believe that Stephen Hitler was giving Bryan Kohberger a fair trial, I do not believe Stephen Hitler was giving Bryan Kohberger a fair trial. But even I told you over and over again, I saw weakness in Stephen Hitler's presentation to Bryan Kohberger, where he was practically pleading Bryan Kohberger not to plead guilty. He said, I want you to understand what the prosecution would have had to have present to you, what they would have had to have proven in court. I want you to understand what they would have proven in court and have them tell you exactly what they would have proven, which essentially was fucking jack and shit. That's what Bill Thompson said. We didn't have jack shit. We don't know how he knew the victims. We don't know how he picked the house. We can't place him at the house. We have nothing but circumstantial evidence. And they told Bryan Kohberger that to his face. And the judge was like, listen, because this sentence, judges have little control once a plea is entered. Stephen Hitler practically was asking Bryan Kohberger to reconsider your plea. You do realize, he told Bryan Kohberger, you do realize you have the right to subpoena, and he might as well have said Bethany Funk, because that's who they were talking about, in my opinion. Bethany Funk was fighting, coming back to the state of Idaho to tell exculpatory evidence that would have made Bryan Kohberger's guilt look a lot less certain. And that's what Ann Taylor wanted to do. And she was being fought, and she was basically being told, you're not going to get Bethany Funk back on the stand. And Stephen Hitler had to remind Kohberger, you realize you do have the right to subpoena people and make them testify on your behalf if they've got exculpatory evidence. Fucking Hitler practically said it to him. You do realize what the state would have had to have proven. And I want you to hear what they would have proven, which was jack and shit. And he still took the plea because judges have little control once the plea is offered. There was a moment in my mind that Stephen Hitler felt that he knew Kohberger was taking a shitty deal because he was forced to, and he was trying to say, look, you have a shot. Despite the fact that I'm stacking this court against you and I'm not letting you bring in a shit ton of stuff, you still have a shot. Fight the fucking thing. But he wouldn't. The guilty often go free. Wealthy white-collar defendants hire elite lawyers, exploit loopholes, and negotiate favorable deals. The more money you have, the better defense you get in America. That is something everyone should know by now. The more money you have, the better defense you get in America. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. If Bryan Kohberger had Karen Agnifilo as his attorney, like Luigi Mangione has, instead of Ann Taylor, and I'm not trying to bust Ann Taylor's proverbial nuts, but the point being is that the difference between a super high-powered, top-of-the-line attorney in the country who gets a fuck ton of money because she's so good, and the public defender is the difference of night and day. Ann Taylor was being run over a little bit by that judge, Stephen Hitler. Run over. She was timid. She was intimidated by his the way that he spoke to her and shot her down every time she tried to present something on Bryan Kohberger's defense. And so she got ramrodded. Karen Agnifilo, that wouldn't have happened to Karen Agnifilo. The more money you have, the better defense you get in this country. Prosecutors are often hesitant to bring charges against corporate or financial wrongdoers, leading to impunity for systemic crimes. So again, prosecutors only go after poor people who can't afford a real defender. Or at least they tend to go after poor people who can't afford a real defender. Systemic inequality. Public defenders are overburdened, underfunded, and create unequal representation. That's what Ann Taylor's whole bitch was about this whole case in the first place. I don't want to work as a public defender anymore because I'm tired of indigent people who don't have money, being ramrodded by a system because they can't afford a good attorney. Racial and class disparities shape who gets prosecuted. Now, that doesn't apply to Kohberger. I don't think it was a racial issue, but let's move on. So other paradoxes of the system. Rakoff, this federal judge, explores additional contradictions, such as harsh punishment for street crime versus leniency for financial crimes. So you can, for example, in the Luigi Mangione case, you can fuck America and deny people's claims and have people die by the thousands because you're denying claims they should have. And that's okay because it's a financial crime. You're just making money for your shareholders. We won't look at that as serious as a guy who shoots somebody in the back. That's a fucking criminal thing. We'll go after the street crime. We won't go after the financial crime, which might have been costing thousands of lives. Sorry to digress on another case, but I covered Luigi Mangione as well. How wrongful convictions persist. Wrongful convictions persist despite exonerating evidence. Again, I believe Bethany Funk had exculpatory evidence that would have exonerated or potentially exonerated Bryan Kohberger. That was never going to be allowed into trial. So wrongful convictions, you could argue Bryan Kohberger took a wrongful conviction because exonerating evidence was never going to be allowed to come forward. We were never going to be allowed to question the FBI's development of Bryan Kohberger's DNA because they knew that it was sketchy and they didn't want it to have to be talked about in court. So we wouldn't get to see it. We wouldn't get to see the exculpatory information that Bethany Funk had because that would lead to reasonable doubt. So wrongful convictions happen in those kind of situations. The erosion of a jury trial once the cornerstone of justice. So we have had, according to this book, we have had an erosion of jury trials, which what used to be the cornerstone of justice. We don't have jury trials much anymore. Why? Because what happens? Karen Reed, for example, everybody who thought she's guilty, she walks. She walks because of a jury trial. And prosecutors and law enforcement are getting tired of people walking because they have good defense. So what's the solution? Overcharge them, give them shitty defense, public defenders, and then make them plea. And then you don't have to go to trial and you don't have to run the risk of losing. All right. Rakoff argues that the U.S. legal system is broken because it allows prosecutors to coerce plea deals from the innocent, while the wealthy and powerful escape accountability. True justice, he suggests, requires rebalancing the power between prosecutors, judges, juries, and the defense. Let's go on to mass incarceration on trial. The summary of mass incarceration on trial is this. Mass incarceration on trial, a remarkable court decision, and the future of prisons in America by Jonathan Simon. The U.S. prison system is overcrowded and inhumane conditions have become so extreme that they violate the Constitution. The court intervention may be the only path to change. The Supreme Court has ruled that overcrowding and such conditions amounted to cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment. We've already heard from Idaho how Bryan Kohberger is in some kind of prison condition in which there's poop, scat on the ground. It's messy, it's dirty, it's inhumane. He's claiming he's not getting the food that he's been ordered. They're not giving him proper care. Those are the situations that happen in our prison systems. It again is as if this entire case was written to accentuate how bad the criminal justice system is broken from top to bottom, from the prosecution of poor people who can't defend themselves by public defenders, getting them to convicted on sketchy scientific data, making them take a plea deal rather than fight it out in court because they're not getting a fair. It's like this entire fucking case is a blueprint. It's like a blueprint funded by the Department of Justice or the National Institute of Justice. It's like that. It sounds so conspiratorial. Simon argues that prisons expose how mass incarceration treats people as disposable rather than citizens with rights. It's already being lined up. Bryan Kohberger is probably going to get killed in prison, and we're just going to accept it. That's just, well, shit just happens. If Bryan Kohberger wasn't running his mouth, if a guard didn't happen to leave a door open at the same time another prisoner is who's violent, leave his door open so the two of them can interchange and that guy can beat Kohberger to death. Hey, shit just happens. Our systems are out of control. They give zero fucks about making sure that prisoners are protected in that system. It is an out of control, inhumane, unconstitutional prison system, and we let it continue to happen. Courts historically defer to legislators and prison officials on prison conditions. Let's let the prison officials tell us whether or not things are being done properly in the prisons. That makes sense. All right, let's continue on with these books. I'm going absolutely. A trial by jury. I'm going to try to get through this in an hour. A trial by jury. Well, let's take a look at a trial by jury. What does that tell us? On Kohberger's shelf. A Trial by Jury by Graham Burnett. The key concept of a trial by jury by Graham Burnett is an exploration of what it means to serve on a to serve as a juror in serious criminal cases, how the experiences forces ordinary citizens to confront the weight of the justice, truth, and personal conscience. Jury as an institution. He examines how 12 strangers are brought together, stripped of their individual lives, and asked to embody the law and conscience of the community. The burden of decision-making. The narrative highlights the intense pressure of determining another person's fate, where reasonable doubt becomes more than an abstract face. Well, guess what? We don't get to present reasonable doubt in Bryan Kohberger's case. We just avoid the jury altogether. That's the way we do things nowadays in America. That's why we have a 90 to 95% plea deal thing instead of going to trial. Conflict between law and morality. Burnett reflects on how jurors wrestle with the imperfect evidence. Was there imperfect evidence in Bryan Kohberger's case? Fuck yes. But guess what? If you don't have a trial, you don't have to show your imperfect evidence. Conflicting testimonies. Was there conflicting testimony in Bryan Kohberger's case? Fuck yes. There were people saying things that weren't true, like perhaps Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. Oh, well, I saw him do this and I saw him do that. No, you didn't, because that couldn't have happened. Oh, well, maybe I was wrong. Those conflicting testimonies, the 8 hours that are missing from when they decided to call 911, all of that shit would have never come out because we weren't going to have a trial. So all the conflicting information they gave, by the way, a grand jury decided that Dylan and Bethany potentially need to be investigated and potentially actually serve time in jail for what they did, because even a grand jury said there's something wrong with those girls' testimony. But guess what? We don't get to do any of that because there won't be a trial. It's like this is a blueprint to show us how bad our judicial system is. Personal transformation. By serving, Burnett himself is changed. He experiences firsthand how fragile justice is, how powerfully social dynamics influence deliberations, and how unsettling it is to hold life-altering authority over another human being. So this book's written by somebody who served on a jury and is giving their firsthand experience. In essence, the book isn't just about one case. It's about the philosophical and civil implications of a jury duty itself. It shows how the jury system forces citizens to grapple with law, morality, truth in ways that textbooks and court transcripts never can. This is also, by the way, why we don't have trials in this country as much as possible anymore, why we accept plea deals, because a jury will get together and they'll be like, wait a minute, the law doesn't make sense in this case. This isn't right. This wasn't done right. They don't want that under a microscope. So you overcharge and you make people plea. All right. I think we're going to skip the Warrior Cop. It's too well known of a book, and it's not all that important. It's just talking about the militarization of the police. We're going to skip that one. But I let the Lord sort them out. We'll do that one, and then the coup de grace, unsafe, and the ivory tower. Let's go to let the Lord sort them out. All right, so let's go to this book real quick. Let the Lord sort them out, right there, by Maurice Shima. The idea of let the Lord sort them out, the rise and fall of the death penalty by Maurice Shima is that the American death penalty, once seen as a permanent fixture of justice, has gone through a cycle of expansion, controversy, and decline, revealing deep flaws in how the U.S. administers punishment. The machinery of death. The book explores how executions actually work in practice, from jury deliberation to appeals, and the role of prosecutors to the corrections officers who carry them out. Exonerations of wrongfully convicted people thanks to DNA evidence and investigative reporting. Much like Emily Basilon's Charged book, which was also on Bryan Kohberger's shelf, Shima uses vivid case studies, prisoners on death row, and defense attorneys and prosecutors and victims' families. The U.S. is one of the few Western democracies that still uses the death penalty. We're one of the few that still use the death penalty, but its use is increasingly concentrated in a handful of states and counties, like Idaho. Why on God's green earth did Bryan Kohberger cross borders into a state that actually does use the death penalty instead of staying in Washington state to do the murders? If all Bryan Kohberger wanted to do was just kill some random people to see what it was like, why not do that in Washington state where you don't have that death penalty? Why go to Idaho for the death penalty state? It makes no sense unless you're doing some kind of freaking case study funded by the National Institute of Justice. It makes you start to ask that question. What the fuck's going on here? And let's just finish with the last one that just absolutely blows my mind. Makes sense to this. An unsafe in the ivory tower. The sexual victimization of college women. Are you fucking kidding me? That's on Bryan Kohberger's shelves, along with all the books about wrongful conviction, being forced with sketchy data, the justice system being out of control, putting pressure on people to that are poor to accept. It's like, I literally cannot make it make sense. I literally cannot. So let's finish with the ivory tower. Let's see if we can find that one. Unsafe in the ivory tower. The key idea from Unsafe in the Ivory Tower, the sexual victimization of college women. Are you fucking shitting me? Are you shitting me right now? This is on Bryan Kohberger's shelf before his arrest in Pennsylvania. This is the books that he was studying about wrongful convictions, about the victimization of college women. And again, not studying for why he's going to go commit the crime. He's studying books on why people get wrongfully convicted of things like sexually victimizing college women. Now, again, Bryan Kohberger was told by Bill Thompson, let me reiterate clearly, there is no sexual element of this crime whatsoever. I want to make that perfectly clear. There's no sexual element in this crime. And yet later on, Steve Gonsalves will come out and say this was a sexually motivated crime. He went there for sexual motivation. He got off on the idea. Which one is it? But anyways, on Kohberger's shelf, The Sexual Victimization of College Women by James Sloan, Bonnie Fisher, and Frances Cullen, is that the risk of sexual assault on college campuses is real, widespread, and shaped by complex social, cultural, and institutional factors. The campus rape myth versus reality. The authors investigate claims that 1 in 4 or 5 women will be sexually assaulted during college. They argue that while sexual victimization is indeed serious and underreported, statistics vary depending on how surveys define assault, who's asked, and how the question's framed. Patterns of victimization. Most assaults involve acquaintances, not strangers. Bryan Kohberger, there's no connection to these victims whatsoever, but most assaults involve acquaintances, not strangers. Alcohol, drugs, and partying. All the girls were said to have been hammered off their ass that night, lowering their inhibitions and impairing their consent. Many victims do not label their experiences as rape, which complicates both reporting and prevention. Sexual assault is underreported. The politics of campus rape. Again, some are maintaining now that the trial's over and Bryan Kohberger never will have a trial, that he was a rapist, that he went there to rape Maddie, and that things went wrong and Kaylee interrupted him in the middle of a rape, and so therefore he had to kill everybody in the house except for Dylan and Bethany. So again, now that the trial is not going to happen, we can say whatever the fuck we want about Bryan Kohberger. The point being is that nothing at all in this case makes any sense to me. When you look at the books on Bryan Kohberger's, let me take my glasses off. I'm pissed off. I don't need to read anymore. When you look at the books on Bryan Kohberger's shelf, make that make sense to me. It is as if, again, the NIJ funded a big, huge amount of money to study certain types of crimes on college campuses, of which the abstract has been hard for me to find. Some have maintained, by the way, that what WSU was funded to do by the NIJ was fund studying crimes in a non-laboratory setting, meaning off campus. So a crime that's committed off campus, and somebody was getting big money to study what happens when crimes are committed off campus in a non-laboratory setting. Now, I can't prove from the abstract, because I'm having problems finding that abstract, that that's exactly what the NIJ was funding. But it's almost as if all of those wild ass conspiracy theories that Bryan Kohberger worked for the feds, that he took the whole job, the PhD candidacy in WSU because WSU had just gotten that big, huge grant to study a certain type of crime. And then he goes there and he's reading books on those types of crimes, of off-campus rapes, victimizations of college women, and how the people who are poor are wrongfully convicted and forced into a false conviction. It's as if that entire fucking thing is a playbook. No wonder some of you say Bryan Kohberger's in witness protection. He's a Fed. This whole thing is a giant PSYOP. And so no wonder some of you say, I'm not even sure victims have died, because you don't have enough blood in that house to make any sense. There's not enough blood in that crime scene to make sense of it. And again, I'm not saying at the end of the day, please, 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 for God's sake, listen to me. I'm not saying at the end of the day that nobody died in that house and it's a giant PSYOP. What I am saying is no wonder people think that, because the blood doesn't make sense. The evidence doesn't make sense. Bryan Kohberger was studying why innocent people plead guilty, and he pled guilty after maintaining his innocence for 2.5 years. He had a public defender and was studying books about how people with public defenders don't get a fair trial. Everything that happened for the past 2.5 years was literally on books in Bryan Kohberger's fucking apartment. Make that shit make sense. I can't do it. Devil's Advocate's out.